Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you from and what time you watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I never thought a simple overnight stop could turn into something I'd replay in my mind every night for months. I was on a road trip, driving from Nashville to Chicago after a long week of work, desperate for some space away from the monotony of my small apartment. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and the highway signs had turned into glowing eyes in the dark. My phone was on 5% battery, and I had no clear idea where I'd sleep. That's when I saw it, a faded sign that read Maplewood Motel, vacancies, its flickering neon light struggling to stay alive, casting a sickly glow on the cracked asphalt. The motel looked old, probably from the 70s, with peeling paint and a strange smell that reminded me of wet carpet mixed with disinfectant. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a rusted pickup truck parked diagonally across from the office. I parked my car and hesitated for a moment. Something about the place felt off, but exhaustion and desperation won over caution. I stepped into the lobby, and the air hit me immediately, stale, cold, and heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed in days. Behind the desk sat a middle-aged man in a faded uniform. His smile was polite but strained, like he was pretending to be happy for my benefit. "Room for the night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded and handed me a brass key attached to a chipped wooden fob. "Room 6. Second floor," he said. "Don't mind the creaks. The old place has character." Character, I thought. That word should have been a warning. I paid in cash and took the stairs to the second floor. The hall smelled of mothballs and something else I couldn't place, something faintly metallic. Room 6 was at the far end, its door slightly ajar as if waiting for me. I hesitated again, the unease in my gut tightening, but I pushed it open. The room was small, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, but it seemed clean enough. There was a bed, a nightstand, and a dresser, all looking like they hadn't been updated in decades. I dropped my bag, plugged in my phone, and sank onto the bed. The hum of the highway outside was distant, muffled, like it was happening somewhere else entirely. I tried to relax, telling myself I was just tired. That's when I noticed it, the mirror across from the bed. I didn't think much of it at first, mirrors are mirrors, right? But the more I stared, the more I felt, watched. Not by someone in the room, but by the mirror itself, reflecting a version of the room that felt slightly wrong, as if it had a life of its own. I shook it off and decided to take a shower. The bathroom was small, the tiles cracked and yellowed with age. As I stripped and turned on the water, I heard it, the faintest creak of the door opening behind me. I froze. "Probably the wind," I muttered, though the door was old and heavy. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had just stepped inside. I hurried through my shower, wrapping a towel around myself, and grabbed my phone, just in case. The rest of the night was a blur of uneasy moments. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the bulb made me jump. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things until I noticed something even stranger: the reflection in the mirror didn't always match reality. Once, I saw the bed wrinkled where I hadn't moved, once a shadow lingered where there shouldn't have been one, and once, I swear, the dresser drawers seemed slightly open when I hadn't touched them. I couldn't sleep. I sat on the bed, my back against the wall, trying to make sense of it. That's when I heard it, whispering. Very soft, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, words forming in a language I couldn't understand. I froze, listening as the whispers circled the room, sometimes coming from the corner behind the bed, sometimes from the mirror. Panic set in. I grabbed my bag, shoved my phone in, and opened the door to leave, but the hallway looked different. Narrower. Darker. The exit signs flickered violently, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. I ran. Down the stairs, out into the parking lot. The night air never felt so good. I looked back at the motel, and I swear I saw someone, or something, standing at the top of the stairs, just watching me leave. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, heart pounding, eyes darting to every rearview mirror. I called a friend once I was safe in a nearby town and tried to explain what happened. They laughed it off, joking about haunted motels and my overactive imagination. But I knew what I'd seen. The mirror, the whispers, the way the room seemed alive, it wasn't my imagination. Months later, I did some digging. Online forums, old news articles, even some Reddit threads about the motel. People had gone missing there, some never found, some found days later, unresponsive, claiming the motel was watching. No one knew why. No one knew how. But every story shared that same chilling detail, the mirror. Always the mirror. I've never stayed at another motel since. And every night, when I close my eyes, I swear I can feel it watching me, waiting, reflecting back my fear. I sometimes wonder, was it even human? Or was it something that had learned how to mimic a motel, a room, a mirror, just to trap people inside its silent, watching gaze? And the worst part? I think it followed me home. Sometimes, when I pass by mirrors in my apartment, I catch a flicker, something in the reflection that shouldn't be there. Something just behind me, smiling. I never considered myself the kind of person who would have a story like this, but after what happened at the Red Pine Motel, I can't convince myself it was just a dream. I was on a cross-country drive from Portland to New York, trying to clear my head after a breakup. The long stretches of empty road were comforting until the rain started pouring, drumming against my windshield with a rhythm that made me feel trapped and exposed at the same time. Visibility was nearly zero, and I needed to stop. That's when I saw it, a small, isolated motel tucked between thick pine trees, glowing under a single flickering street lamp. Its sign simply read Red Pine Motel, Welcome. No neon, no colorful letters, just plain and simple. The parking lot was wet and glistened under the lamp, reflecting the dark outline of the motel like a mirror. Oddly, no cars were parked there except for a single black sedan with tinted windows. I shrugged, telling myself the isolation was part of the charm, and stepped inside. The lobby was eerily quiet. A musty smell hung in the air, mixed with something faintly metallic. Behind the counter sat a woman, older than I expected, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Evening," I said, trying to break the silence. "Do you have a room for the night?" She nodded slowly, her voice low and deliberate. "I do. But I only have one special room left." "Special?" I asked, curious. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes. Room 13. It doesn't have a number on the door. You'll know it when you see it." That should have been my first warning. Instead, I was too tired and too soaked to care. I paid her, took the key, and headed down the narrow hallway. Each step echoed loudly against the worn carpet, and the walls felt closer with every step, like the motel was subtly shrinking around me. At the end of the hall was a door with no number, just slightly scratched wood, darker than the others. I hesitated, key in hand, heart thudding. Something told me not to open it, but curiosity, fatigue, and that irrational sense of needing shelter pushed me forward. Inside, the room was small, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, the yellowish glow giving the space a sickly warmth. There was a bed, a chair, a small desk, and a wardrobe with a broken mirror. But what struck me first was the window. It was completely black, not because of the night outside, but because it reflected the interior of the room perfectly. I blinked, and for a moment, I could swear I saw someone, or something, standing behind the bed in the reflection. I spun around. Nothing. Just the chair, the bed, and the dim bulb. I tried to settle in, convincing myself I was tired, overworked, and the storm outside was playing tricks on my mind. But the room had a presence, a subtle weight that pressed down on my chest, making breathing feel slightly harder. I unpacked a few things and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to shake the feeling. That's when I noticed it, a small notebook on the desk, open as if someone had been writing in it. On the page were words written in messy, uneven handwriting: "You shouldn't be here. Leave now before it notices." My stomach dropped. I laughed nervously, telling myself it must have been left by a previous guest. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The notebook seemed alive, as if it had been waiting for me to see it. I tried to sleep, but the room made that impossible. Every creak of the floorboards sounded deliberate, like someone pacing just out of sight. The wardrobe mirror caught my eye constantly, and every time I glanced at it, I swore I saw shadows shifting behind me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. The rain outside had stopped, but the darkness in the room was absolute, swallowing the dim light completely. Then I heard it, a whisper. Faint, almost too quiet to hear. My name. Matthew. It came from the corner by the wardrobe. I froze, eyes wide, heart pounding. The whisper repeated, this time louder, insistent. Matthew, leave. I scrambled to grab my jacket, my phone, anything to get out. But when I tried the door, it wouldn't budge. Locked from the inside, though I hadn't locked it. Panic clawed at me. I turned back toward the wardrobe mirror, and what I saw made my blood run cold. My reflection wasn't mimicking me anymore. It stood behind me, tall, faceless, with limbs too long for a human body. Its head tilted in a way that made no sense, and its shadow stretched across the room like ink spilling on a page. I stumbled backward, tripping over the chair, desperate for escape. And then the whispering intensified. All around me now, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, stay, 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 I screamed, pounding on the door, but it didn't respond. My phone, my only link to the outside world, had no signal. I felt trapped in a nightmare that had bled into reality. Hours, I think hours, passed. Or maybe it was seconds. I don't know. The room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting around me, shadows growing, shrinking, twisting. Then, abruptly, silence. The mirror reflected the room perfectly now, as if nothing had happened. The door unlocked itself with a soft click. I didn't hesitate. I ran, slipping on the wet pavement outside, never looking back. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I tried to find the Red Pine Motel online, but there were no listings, no reviews, nothing. It was as if it never existed. Some obscure travel forum mentioned a disappearing motel in the woods, but the stories were all vague, unverified, and eerily similar: rooms that trap you, reflections that aren't reflections, whispers that beg you to stay. The thing that haunts me most is that notebook. I never took it with me, I couldn't. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear my name whispered softly, almost lovingly, calling me back. And in the corner of my apartment, when the lights are low, I see a dark patch in the mirror that wasn't there before, waiting. I'll admit it, I've always been a light sleeper, but what happened at the Pine Hollow Motel pushed me into a level of paranoia I didn't think was possible. I was traveling through rural Pennsylvania on my way to a family reunion in Cleveland, and it was already past midnight when my car started acting up. I had no choice but to pull off the deserted highway and look for a place to stay. That's when I saw it, almost hidden among the shadows of pine trees, a small, two-story motel with a flickering sign that read Pine Hollow, rooms available. The building looked like it had been untouched for decades. The paint was peeling, the windows streaked with rain, and a single light above the office swayed, casting long shadows on the cracked asphalt. My instincts screamed to keep driving, but fatigue and fear won out. I parked near the entrance and stepped inside, where the air was thick and damp, like the motel had been closed for weeks. A woman at the front desk looked up slowly. She had dark circles under her eyes and a soft, almost whispery voice. "Room for the night?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Room 9. Top floor. Last one available." The elevator was out of order, so I trudged up the narrow staircase, each step groaning beneath my weight. Room 9 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, expecting the usual creaky furniture and dim lighting. But the room was different, pristine, almost unnaturally so. The bed was perfectly made, the carpet freshly vacuumed, and a soft smell of lavender hung in the air. It should have been comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to brush it off and set my bag down. I noticed, however, a small notebook on the nightstand. I opened it curiously. It was blank, except for a single sentence on the first page: "He watches. He waits." My skin prickled, but I laughed nervously. Probably just the previous guest playing a joke. The night started off uneventfully. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my racing mind. But around 2 a.m., I began hearing it, soft footsteps in the hallway outside my door. At first, I thought it was other guests. But the motel had been nearly empty when I arrived. There shouldn't have been anyone else. The steps stopped just outside my door. A silence so heavy it almost hurt my ears followed. Then, a soft tap. 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 I froze. My heart pounded. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they were standing there, listening. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I considered calling the front desk, but I didn't even know what I'd say. So I stayed still, listening. Then the sound moved. Slowly, deliberately, it moved across the hallway and stopped at the room directly above mine. Tap. Tap. A shadow passed by the frosted glass of the ceiling window. I couldn't tell what it was, but I knew someone was there. Someone was watching. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed. Exhaustion mingled with fear, and I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, only to wake to something worse. The door to my room was slightly ajar, even though I had locked it before going to bed. I got up slowly, heart in my throat. Nothing had been stolen. Everything was in place. But there was a presence, heavy in the air, like someone had been sitting in the corner, waiting. I spent the rest of the night alternating between watching the door and staring at the window. The morning light didn't bring comfort, just clarity. There were no footprints outside the room, no signs of another guest. But I noticed something strange: the notebook had moved. It was no longer on the nightstand, it was on the floor beside the bed, open to a new page. On it was written, "You cannot leave yet." I panicked, grabbed my bag, and ran out of the room, down the staircase, and out into the cold morning air. I didn't even stop to pay the woman at the front desk. My only goal was to get back on the highway. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been with me. The apartment felt empty, yet heavy, like the motel had followed me. Sometimes, when I woke in the middle of the night, I'd hear soft tapping at the bedroom door. I never opened it. Months after that night, I saw a Reddit post describing a similar experience at Pine Hollow. A man had stayed in room 9 and reported the same notebook, the same footsteps, the same tapping. The kicker? He wrote that he had been alone in the motel. I never stayed in a motel again. And every time I pass an empty hotel hallway or a dark room, I feel it, the silent guest, still waiting, still watching, waiting for me to return. I should have known something was wrong the moment I pulled off Route 66 into that small, unassuming town in Oklahoma. My car's engine had been making strange noises all day, and I was desperate for a place to stay. The sky was a dull orange from the setting sun, and a cold wind carried dust and the faint smell of rot. That's when I saw it, the Willow Creek Motel. Its neon sign flickered lazily, the letters half-lit, giving the place an almost haunted charm. There was something about the emptiness of the parking lot, and the quiet hush that surrounded the building, that made my skin crawl, but I was too tired to care. Inside, the lobby was small, sparsely furnished, with linoleum floors that squeaked under my feet. Behind the counter sat a man who looked as if he'd been there since the motel was built, which might not have been far from the truth. He smiled faintly when I approached, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Room?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. He leaned forward, resting his thin hands on the counter. "I have one left," he said slowly. "Room 11. But, be careful. It doesn't always behave as expected." I blinked. "Doesn't behave?" He shrugged, almost apologetically. You'll see. Keys are tricky sometimes. Some rooms don't like visitors who aren't careful. I tried to laugh it off, handed him cash, and took the brass key he placed in my hand. Room 11 was at the end of a long hallway on the second floor. As I walked, the overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting elongated shadows across the walls. Each step I took echoed like a warning. The door to room 11 was old, scratched, and slightly warped. I inserted the key, but it didn't turn smoothly. I jiggled it, pushed harder, and finally, with a reluctant click, the lock gave way. The door creaked open to reveal a room that was wrong. The furniture looked normal at first, but the angles were slightly off. The bed was too high, the desk too low, and the mirror reflected the room with subtle distortions that made it look larger than it was. I set my bag down, trying to ignore the strange geometry of the space. I noticed a dresser drawer that was slightly open. I hadn't touched it, and I was positive of that. When I approached, I saw a folded piece of paper inside. I unfolded it. The words were scrawled in messy handwriting. You were never meant to be here. Leave before it notices. The hair on my arm stood up. I laughed nervously, convincing myself it was a prank by a previous guest. But the air in the room grew colder, heavier, as if it were pressing down on me. I tried to ignore it and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to plan my next move. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt fractured in that room. The lights flickered again, and the mirror seemed to ripple, distorting my reflection. That's when I heard it, the whisper of someone breathing behind me. I spun around. Nothing. The wardrobe doors were closed, and the bed was empty. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but the sound persisted, soft, deliberate, coming from all corners of the room at once. I attempted to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The key, which had worked before, now refused to turn. I pulled harder, my heart racing, sweat soaking my shirt. Then, the whispering grew louder, forming words I couldn't quite understand, but the tone was unmistakable, impatient, warning, and terrifyingly insistent. Desperate, I ran to the mirror, hoping to find an alternate escape. And then I saw it. My reflection wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror mimicked my movements, but its head tilted at impossible angles, and its eyes glowed faintly red. I stumbled back, tripping over the chair, my breath ragged. The figure stepped closer in the reflection, though I was frozen in place, unable to move. Then, just as suddenly, it vanished. The door unlocked with a soft click. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and ran out into the night, never glancing back. The lobby was empty, the receptionist nowhere to be seen. The motel looked ordinary in the moonlight, the flickering sign now steady. Weeks later, I tried to find the Willow Creek Motel online. Nothing. No reviews, no listings, not even on maps. I mentioned it to friends, who joked about haunted motels and overactive imaginations. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Sometimes, late at night, I see a key on my dresser, brass, old, with a worn wooden fob. I never touch it. But I swear, just before I fall asleep, I hear a faint click and the sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the darkness, waiting for me. I didn't plan to stay at the Blue Haven Motel. I was driving back from a business trip in Michigan, and a late snowstorm forced me off the highway. My GPS had been acting up, and all nearby hotels were either booked or didn't answer. That's when I spotted it, a small, two-story motel nestled between a frozen river and a dense line of pines. Its neon sign flickered weakly, spelling out Blue Haven Motel in half-lit letters. The place was empty, eerily quiet, but I was too tired and too cold to keep driving. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, the wallpaper yellowed and peeling at the edges. A single receptionist, an older man with graying hair and a threadbare uniform, looked up as I entered. He gave me a nod but said nothing until I spoke. "Room for the night?" I asked, shivering. He hesitated, studying me with an unreadable expression. "Room 7, he said finally. Top floor. Last one available. I paid in cash and took the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hall was long, with faded floral carpeting and faint scratches on the walls. When I reached room 7, I noticed something odd. The door had a fresh scratch along the frame, like it had been forced open recently. I brushed it off as a maintenance issue and unlocked the door. The room was small and neat, furnished with a bed, a nightstand, and a dresser. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else I couldn't identify, something almost metallic. I set my bag down and tried to relax, but the sense that I wasn't alone lingered. It started subtly. At first, it was just the feeling of being watched, the sense that someone, or something, was observing me. Then I noticed it. The reflection in the small dresser mirror seemed slightly off. The angle of the reflection didn't match reality, and shadows moved in ways that defied logic. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but the feeling intensified as night fell. Around midnight, I heard the first knock. Soft, deliberate, coming from the wall behind the bed. I froze, straining my ears. Another knock. Then a low whisper, almost indistinguishable, calling my name. My heart pounded, and I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I got up cautiously and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. The snow outside had muffled most sounds, leaving the motel silent except for the hum of the old heating system. I returned to the room, trying to calm myself. That's when I noticed something on the bed, a note, written in jagged handwriting. "He's here. Don't look behind you." I froze. He? Who was he? I looked around the room, every shadow now seeming alive. The dresser mirror reflected a dark figure in the corner, just standing there, barely moving, faceless in the dim light. I blinked, and it was gone. I spent hours pacing the room, listening. The knocking and whispering came again, persistent, teasing. I finally sank onto the bed, exhausted, and tried to sleep, but the room seemed to breathe around me, walls shifting slightly, shadows stretching unnaturally. When I woke, it was morning, but the room felt wrong. The note was gone, the bed unmade though I hadn't moved, and the mirror reflected an empty room. I felt relieved at first, but then I noticed the door. Room 7, the one I had entered the night before, now had a small, sticky note attached to it in familiar handwriting. "See you tonight." I didn't wait. I ran down the stairs, out of the lobby, and into the snow. The receptionist wasn't there. The building looked abandoned, windows dark, as if no one had stayed there for decades. I drove off, leaving the motel behind. Weeks later, I tried to find Blue Haven Motel online. Nothing existed, no listings, no reviews, nothing. I told friends, but they laughed it off, saying I was stressed or tired. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Now, every time I stay at a hotel or motel, I check the doors and mirrors repeatedly. Sometimes, when I pass a mirror, I swear I see a shadow lingering just behind me, faceless and silent. And late at night, when the wind howls through my apartment, I hear the soft knocking again, and a whisper that says my name. Matthew. I was on a solo road trip through New Mexico when I first saw the Desert Rose Motel. I had been driving for hours along a barren stretch of highway, the sun dipping low and casting long, burning orange shadows across the sand. My eyes were heavy, and the thought of stopping in a townless area made me anxious, but the flickering neon sign promising Desert Rose Motel, vacancies, was too tempting to pass by. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a single black SUV parked haphazardly near the office. The building itself seemed ordinary from the outside, but the second I stepped into the lobby, I felt a strange shift. The air was thick, almost heavy, with a faint odor of bleach and something else I couldn't place, earthy, almost like decaying wood. Behind the desk was a man in his 50s with a face that looked carved from stone. He didn't smile, just handed me a key. "Room 12, he said softly. "Second floor. You'll find it easily enough." I nodded, paid in cash, and made my way to the narrow staircase. Each step creaked under my weight, echoing through the silent motel. At the top, I turned toward the hallway, and froze. The corridor seemed unnaturally long. The walls stretched farther than they should have, and the light fixtures flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced in unnatural ways. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired. Room 12 was at the very end, or at least it should have been. As I walked, I noticed the numbers didn't increase as expected. Oddly enough, the doors seemed identical, and the hallway never ended. I started counting steps, expecting to reach room 12, but the numbers on the doors never matched, and every door looked exactly the same. My stomach twisted with unease. I finally found a door labeled 12. I inserted the key, but it felt strange in my hand, heavier than normal. The lock clicked, and the door swung open to reveal a room bathed in dim yellow light. The layout was typical: a bed, nightstand, small dresser, but something about it felt off, like the walls leaned in slightly, watching. I tried to relax. I unpacked, sat on the bed, and tried to get comfortable. But every time I glanced toward the hallway from the room's window, it seemed longer than before, stretching infinitely in both directions. I told myself it was a trick of fatigue, yet the unease remained. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft shuffle outside my door. I froze. The hallway outside seemed impossibly long, shadows pooling near the walls. Another shuffle, closer this time. My heart thumped violently in my chest. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I considered calling the front desk, but the lobby felt miles away, and I was paralyzed by fear. The shuffling grew louder, followed by a soft tapping, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. Then, a whisper, so faint I could barely hear it, "Don't leave." I swung the door open, intending to run, but the hallway wasn't what I expected. The corridor twisted and turned impossibly. It curved back on itself, creating a loop that I knew shouldn't exist. The doors were identical, indistinguishable, and the number 12 appeared repeatedly in front of me as if the hallway had no end. Panic set in. I tried to retrace my steps, but the hallway seemed to shift, walls subtly moving, extending farther and farther. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed on the floor. That's when I noticed something new: the shadows. They were not cast by the lights but moved independently, pooling near the doors, stretching, and bending toward me. One shadow coalesced into a humanoid shape, faceless, dark, and watching. It didn't move like a person but rather like a liquid mass taking form. I scrambled backward toward what I hoped was the exit, but the hallway twisted again. The numbers on the doors changed, looping in impossible sequences. Room 12 was everywhere and nowhere. The whispering grew, chanting in a language I couldn't understand, a low, guttural hum that vibrated in my bones. Desperate, I picked a door at random, threw it open, and stumbled into a room. The room was empty, except for a single mirror on the far wall. In the reflection, I saw the hallway extending infinitely behind me. And then I realized, the shadow was standing right behind me in the reflection, though when I turned, there was nothing there. I bolted, running blindly down the twisting hallway. Each turn brought me back to the same identical doors. The numbers 12 glowed faintly on each one, mocking me. My chest burned, my legs screamed, and fear gripped me like a vice. At dawn, exhausted and trembling, I finally stumbled out of the motel lobby, gasping for air. The receptionist, who had been absent all night, was now there, polishing the counter. He looked up at me, expressionless. "Room 12 treats some guests differently," he said calmly. "Some never leave." I didn't wait for an explanation. I got in my car and drove until the motel disappeared behind me in the morning haze. Weeks later, I tried to find it online. There was nothing. No listing, no record, no reviews. But sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I swear I can see that endless hallway. The doors labeled 12 stretch infinitely before me, shadows pooling at the corners. And I hear the whispering, "You should not have left." I was driving through rural Montana in late October when the storm hit. The sky turned a dark gray, and the wind carried an icy chill that made my hands numb despite the heater blasting in the car. I was exhausted from the long drive, my eyes stinging from constant focus on the endless highway. That's when I saw it, the Whispering Pines Motel. Its weathered wooden sign swayed in the wind, letters faded almost to the point of illegibility. A faint yellow glow from the lobby windows offered a flicker of hope. The parking lot was empty, save for a single rusted sedan parked near the entrance. The building looked like it had been frozen in time, peeling paint, warped siding, and a roof that sagged in the middle. My gut twisted, warning me to keep driving, but my exhaustion won out. I grabbed my bag and entered. The lobby was dark and musty, lit by a single overhead bulb that flickered intermittently. Behind the counter was a woman, older, with hair pulled back tightly. Her eyes were unusually sharp, almost piercing. She didn't greet me, only nodded as I approached. "Room for the night?" I asked. She pointed silently to a key resting on the counter. On it was the number 5. "Top floor," she said, her voice quiet and deliberate. The staircase creaked under my weight as I climbed, each step echoing ominously through the empty hall. The second floor was lined with faded wallpaper and doors with numbers peeling from the paint. Room 5 was at the far end, a door slightly warped and cracked. The key fit perfectly, but the lock turned with unexpected resistance. Inside, the room seemed normal at first. A bed neatly made, a dresser, and a small desk with a lamp. The air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. I set my bag down and immediately noticed a guest book sitting on the desk. It looked ancient, leather-bound and fragile, with yellowed pages. Curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open. The entries were dated decades back, names of travelers long forgotten, recounting their stays in polite detail. But as I skimmed further, the entries changed tone. They became frantic, messy, and occasionally illegible. One entry read, "Do not trust the room. It sees you. It moves when you're not looking." Another, "I woke up and the walls had changed. The door was gone. I can still hear it whispering." A chill ran down my spine. I closed the book and set it aside, trying to convince myself that the previous guests were either joking or delusional. But the unease didn't go away. As night fell, the room seemed to grow darker, heavier, the shadows stretching along the walls unnaturally. Around midnight, I was woken by a soft scratching sound coming from the corner of the room near the wardrobe. At first, I assumed it was the wind or an old building settling, but the sound grew sharper, more deliberate. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, no light, nothing. The lamp flickered violently, and then, in a sudden instant, went out. I was plunged into darkness. My eyes strained, trying to adjust, when I noticed a shadow moving across the wall. Not cast by anything in the room, but independent, sliding like liquid across the floor. I froze, heart pounding. The shadow elongated and twisted into a vaguely human form, faceless, dark, and observing. I backed into the corner, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. That's when I heard the whisper, "Why are you reading my stories?" The words came from everywhere at once, behind me, inside the shadow, almost from the pages of the guest book that had been left open on the desk. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My hands shook as I tried to move toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The room had changed subtly, the walls seemed to pulse, the floor shifted slightly, and the door now looked different, older, warped, as if it had never existed before. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I had no sense of time. I clutched the guest book, realizing that each name in it was still in the room somehow, trapped in a state between life and memory. Then, just as abruptly, the shadows withdrew, the lamp flickered back to life, and the room looked normal again. The guest book had closed itself. I ran down the stairs, out into the empty parking lot. The receptionist was gone, leaving only the flickering light from the lobby. I drove away without looking back. Weeks later, I tried to find Whispering Pines Motel online. Nothing. Not a single record existed. But the guest book. I can't stop thinking about it. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can see the names, the frantic writing, the whispering of the forgotten guests. And late at night, I hear scratching sounds in my apartment, soft at first, growing louder, as if someone, or something, is still waiting for me to read their story. I had been driving through rural Arkansas late at night, the kind of night where even the stars seem distant and cold. The highway was desolate, flanked by dense pine forests that whispered in the wind. My car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only small patches of the road ahead. I was exhausted, my body screaming for rest, when I saw a dim neon sign flickering weakly, Cedar Creek Motel, rooms available. The parking lot was empty except for a single white van parked near the office. The building looked ordinary, but the way the light flickered across the weathered siding gave it a subtle, almost sinister presence. I parked my car and walked into the lobby. It was small and dimly lit, with faded floral wallpaper and a thick layer of dust covering the counter. Behind the desk was a man who looked older than he should have, his eyes pale and unreadable. He nodded at me without a word, as though he had been expecting me. "I need a room for the night," I said. He held out a brass key. "Room 8, he said softly. "Top floor. Don't mind the quirks. The room doesn't like surprises." I raised an eyebrow but decided not to question it. Sleep was more important. I took the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hallway was dim, lined with doors whose paint was chipped and peeling. Room 8 was at the end, its door warped slightly as if the building had shifted over the years. I inserted the key and turned it. The lock resisted briefly, then clicked open. The room was small and neat. A bed, nightstand, dresser, and a single window overlooking the empty parking lot. The air smelled faintly of damp carpet and old wood. I set my bag down and tried to relax, but something felt off. The room seemed alive. Not in the literal sense, but the angles of the walls were subtly wrong. Every time I looked away and back again, objects seemed slightly displaced. I went to the window and looked outside. The white van was gone. That was odd, it had been there when I arrived. I shrugged it off and tried to sleep, but the feeling of unease didn't subside. Around midnight, I heard a soft scraping sound from the corner of the room. My eyes darted to the dresser. The drawers were moving slowly, sliding open and then closing as if guided by invisible hands. I stumbled backward onto the bed, heart pounding. The air grew colder, thicker, as though the room itself was breathing. I tried to call the front desk, but my phone had no signal. The light above flickered violently, and in the brief flashes, I saw something standing in the corner, a shadowy figure, faceless, stretching impossibly toward the ceiling. I scrambled to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the shadow moved closer, though it made no sound, no footsteps, only an almost liquid motion that defied physics. I backed toward the bed, my body trembling uncontrollably. Then, in a flash, the room changed. The walls shifted, the bed disappeared, and I found myself standing in a long corridor lined with doors I didn't recognize. Each door looked identical, numbered in sequence, but none matched the room I had entered. I tried opening one, any one, but each door led to the same corridor, looping endlessly. The whispers began then, faint at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. They grew louder, more insistent, chanting my name, echoing off the warped walls. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Time had no meaning. I stumbled into a room with a mirror on the far wall. My reflection wasn't mine. The figure from before was there, standing silently behind me, stretching, faceless, its form shifting constantly. I spun around, nothing. The mirror reflected it perfectly, though, as if mocking me. Finally, as dawn approached, the corridor twisted one last time, and I stumbled into the lobby. The receptionist was gone. The motel looked empty, abandoned, the neon sign flickering weakly in the morning light. I didn't stop. I ran to my car and drove off, my hands shaking, glancing nervously at every rearview mirror. Weeks later, I tried to find the Cedar Creek Motel online. Nothing. No records, no maps, no history. I asked locals, but no one had ever heard of it. Yet the memory lingers. Late at night, I swear I can see the walls of room 8 bending, stretching, whispering my name, waiting for me to return. And sometimes, when I look into a mirror in my apartment, I see a shadow behind me, faceless and dark, stretching upward, reminding me that room 8 never truly let me go. I never considered myself a believer in the paranormal, but what happened at the Silver Oak Motel in northern Missouri changed everything. I was traveling late one November night, driving home after visiting family. The highway was quiet, almost eerily so, and the wind howled against the car like some living thing. Exhausted, I saw a faint glow through the trees, the Silver Oak Motel. Its neon sign flickered weakly, half-lit, advertising vacancies, open 24 hours. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a rusted pickup parked far in the corner. The building seemed ordinary, but its silence was suffocating. I parked and walked inside, feeling an unshakable sense of unease. The lobby was dimly lit, decorated in outdated brown and beige tones, and smelled faintly of mothballs and old carpet. A woman behind the desk looked up at me, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Room?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly. She nodded. "Room 10, she said quietly. "Top floor. Last one available. Don't leave anything behind." The words chilled me, though I didn't know why. I paid in cash and took the creaking staircase to the second floor. The hallway was lined with identical doors, each numbered but faded. Room 10 was at the end. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The room looked standard at first, a bed, dresser, desk, and nightstand. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, mingled with something metallic I couldn't identify. I set my bag down and tried to relax, but something felt off. The shadows in the corners didn't align with the lighting. The room seemed stretched, like the angles were subtly wrong. I tried to sleep, but around midnight, I woke to a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was the old plumbing, but the sound was deliberate, coming from the corner near the dresser. I held my breath. Then came a whisper, soft but unmistakable, "Don't leave." I froze. My mind raced. I got out of bed and moved toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The key, which had worked before, now seemed stuck, as if the lock itself had become part of the room. Panic gripped me. I turned toward the dresser, and that's when I saw it. My reflection in the small mirror didn't match me. Behind me, in the reflection, a shadowy figure stood tall and faceless. Its head tilted at impossible angles, and it didn't move like a person, but more like liquid, shifting and stretching. I spun around. Nothing. My room was empty. But when I looked back at the mirror, the figure remained, closer now, just behind me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I scrambled toward the bed, then the window, but the window showed only an endless corridor, not the outside world. I realized then that the room itself had changed, stretched in impossible ways. My heart pounded, my vision blurred with terror. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I had no sense of time. I tried the door again. It opened slightly, enough for me to peek into the hallway. But the hallway was endless, twisting impossibly, lined with doors numbered 10 over and over. I ran blindly, every door leading back to the same corridor. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping, "Stay, stay, stay." Finally, exhausted, I slammed into a door and collapsed. I opened it, and I was back in room 10. Everything looked normal, as if nothing had happened. But the mirror showed the figure standing in the corner, watching. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. At dawn, I bolted out of the motel without stopping to pay. The parking lot was empty, the building quiet and lifeless. Weeks later, I tried to find the Silver Oak Motel online. Nothing. It didn't exist. No reviews, no listings, no history. But I still see it sometimes. When I close my eyes, the hallway stretches infinitely, the doors numbered 10, the whispering relentless. And at night, when I look in the mirrors in my apartment, I catch a flicker of that faceless figure, reminding me that room 10 never truly let me go. It was late September when I decided to take a solo road trip through the backroads of West Virginia. The air was crisp, the leaves turning fiery shades of orange and red, but the long drive left me exhausted. My car's headlights cut through the darkness as I followed the winding road through the forest. I hadn't seen a single town in hours when a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance: Havenwood Motel, vacancies. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a lone, old-fashioned pickup truck parked near the entrance. The building looked aged, but not in the charming, vintage way, more like it had been abandoned and barely maintained. I parked and entered the lobby, where the smell of stale coffee and dust greeted me. The receptionist was a man in his 60s, with deep lines etched into his face, and eyes that seemed to weigh every word I said. "I need a room for the night," I said. "Room 4, he replied slowly. "Top floor. One night only. And, don't answer if it calls you." I laughed nervously, though the tone in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. I paid and carried my bag up the narrow staircase. The hallways were dim, with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights. Room 4 was at the far end. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room looked normal: a bed, nightstand, small dresser, but something felt subtly off. The air was too heavy, the shadows too dark. I set my bag down and tried to ignore the unease building inside me. That's when I noticed the first hint of strangeness. The dresser mirror reflected the room, but there was a second bed in the reflection that wasn't in the room itself. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. I examined the mirror carefully, but the reflection remained unchanged. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to pulse slightly, like it was breathing. I tried to shake it off and went to bed, though I slept fitfully. Around midnight, I woke to a low humming. It wasn't music, but a chant of sorts, soft, almost imperceptible at first. I sat up and listened. It was coming from beneath the bed. My heart pounded. I peeked under the bed, nothing. Then the humming grew louder, moving to the walls, the ceiling, the corners. Whispered voices filled the room, overlapping and unintelligible. I got up and approached the dresser mirror. That's when I saw them, shadowy figures standing in the reflection, faceless, clustered near the second bed that didn't exist. They moved slowly, shifting, pressing closer. I spun around. The room was empty. But the reflection remained. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my bag and tried the door. It wouldn't open. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. I sat on the bed, trembling, watching the mirror as the shadows in the reflection grew taller, more distinct. I realized with growing terror that these were previous guests, trapped in some eternal limbo, staring at me through the glass. The humming became chanting, repeating over and over, "Stay, stay with us." Suddenly, the door swung open. I bolted down the hallway, the shadows in the mirror following me in silence. I didn't look back, even as I reached the lobby. The receptionist was gone. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering weakly in the pre-dawn light. I jumped in my car and drove until the motel vanished behind me. Weeks later, I tried to find Havenwood Motel online. Nothing. No reviews, no records, no directions. Yet, I still see it sometimes. When I close my eyes, the faceless guests peer at me from the corners of my mind. And occasionally, in the reflection of a mirror at home, I catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye, standing silently, waiting, whispering, "Join us." I was driving through the remote stretches of northern Colorado in early November when the snow began falling hard. The roads were slick, and visibility was near zero. I had no choice but to find shelter, and after what felt like hours, I saw a flickering neon sign in the distance: Silver Pines Motel, vacancies. The building was small, wooden, and worn with age, its windows dimly lit. It looked abandoned, yet the sign promised warmth and a room for the night. The parking lot was empty, except for a single black sedan parked crookedly near the entrance. I stepped inside the lobby, where the air was thick with the scent of mildew and old carpet. Behind the counter stood an older man with tired eyes and a weathered face, who didn't greet me immediately but instead studied me as if measuring my intentions. "Room for one," I said, my voice tight from cold and fatigue. "Room 13, he said finally, sliding a brass key toward me. "Upstairs. Last one available. Don't go to the locked door." I paused. "Locked door?" He nodded, his eyes serious. "Just don't. That room isn't for guests." I laughed nervously and took the key anyway. Sleep was more important than cryptic warnings. I climbed the narrow, creaking staircase to the second floor. The hall was lined with identical doors, paint peeling and numbers faded. Room 13 was at the end, its doors slightly warped from years of weather and neglect. I inserted the key and turned it, stepping inside. The room looked normal: a bed, dresser, nightstand, small television. The air smelled faintly of bleach, mixed with something earthy and old. I set my bag down and tried to relax, but the warning from the receptionist lingered. Something about the room felt alive: subtle movements in the corners, shadows that didn't align with the light, as if they were shifting just out of my line of sight. Hours passed uneventfully, and I finally drifted off. But around midnight, I awoke to the faint sound of a creak, like a door opening slowly upstairs. My heart thumped. I tried to dismiss it as the building settling, but the sound persisted, deliberate and echoing across the hallway. I remembered the receptionist's words: "Don't go to the locked door." Curiosity mixed with terror. I slipped out of bed and slowly approached the hall. At the end of the corridor, a door, painted a darker shade than the others, marked only by a faint scratch near the handle, was slightly ajar. A cold draft seeped through, carrying whispers so faint I couldn't make out the words. My instincts screamed to leave, but something drew me closer. I pushed the door open and froze. The room beyond wasn't like the rest of the motel. It stretched impossibly, walls receding into darkness, the floor tilting subtly. In the center stood a large mirror, its surface shimmering as if wet. And in the reflection, I saw dozens of shadowy figures, faceless, shifting, pressing closer. Some were kneeling, others standing silently. All of them seemed to stare at me directly, though when I turned, the room was empty. A low whisper rose from the mirror, growing louder: "Join us, stay, forever." Panic surged. I slammed the door shut and stumbled back to my room, breathing heavily, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But when I checked the mirror inside my own room, the figures were there, reflected faintly in the glass, watching me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting on the bed, staring at the door. At dawn, I packed my bag and fled down the stairs, never looking back. The receptionist was gone, the lobby empty, and the neon sign flickered weakly in the morning light. Weeks later, I tried to find Silver Pines Motel online. There were no records, no listings, nothing. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that locked door, stretching into infinite darkness, and the whispering grows louder in my mind: "You should have stayed." It was late autumn when I found myself driving through the winding backroads of Oregon, returning home after visiting a friend in Portland. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a chill in the air and an eerie darkness that seemed to swallow the road. My car's headlights barely pierced the fog that rolled in from the nearby forest, and fatigue weighed heavily on me. That's when I saw the sign: Crescent Pines Motel, rooms available. The neon flickered erratically, casting an unsettling glow over the nearly empty parking lot. The building itself was old, wooden, and looked as though it had weathered countless storms. A faint hum of electricity ran through the flickering lights, giving the place a tense, alive quality. I parked and entered the lobby, where the air smelled like stale coffee mixed with mildew. Behind the counter stood a woman with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "Room?" I asked, trying to sound casual despite the growing unease in my chest. "Room 6, she said softly, handing me a brass key. "Top floor. Don't look into the mirror too long." I forced a laugh, dismissing her warning as old motel superstition, and climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hallway was lined with faded wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked under my steps. Room 6 was at the end, its door slightly warped and a number barely visible. I inserted the key and stepped inside. The room was small but neat, a bed, dresser, nightstand, and a large mirror leaning against the far wall. I set my bag down and noticed immediately that the reflection in the mirror didn't quite match the room. The angles were subtly off, and shadows pooled unnaturally. I told myself I was imagining things and tried to relax. Around midnight, I awoke to the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. They were slow, deliberate, and seemed to echo unnaturally. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. Then, as I stared into the mirror, I noticed movement behind me, though when I turned, there was nothing there. The reflection showed a shadowy figure standing in the corner, faceless and still, but its presence was undeniable. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The figure began to move toward me in the reflection, though I remained frozen. I blinked, and it was gone. Trying to calm myself, I turned back to the bed and noticed the mirror had changed again. The reflection no longer showed the room accurately. The walls stretched infinitely, doors appeared where none existed, and the shadowy figure was now one among many, crowding the room, pressing closer. Whispered voices emanated from the glass, repeating my name over and over, "You should not be here, stay." Fear paralyzed me. I grabbed the mirror, intending to move it, but it was impossibly heavy, like it was anchored by something unseen. The shadows pressed closer in the reflection, but when I turned around, the room was empty. The whispering became louder, more insistent, vibrating in my skull. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Exhaustion overcame me, and I finally collapsed onto the bed. When I awoke in the morning, the room appeared normal again. The mirror reflected only my own tired face, the shadows gone. I bolted downstairs, leaving the key on the counter, but the receptionist was nowhere to be seen. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering weakly. Weeks later, I tried to find Crescent Pines Motel online. Nothing existed, no record, no reviews, no maps. But sometimes, late at night, when I see a mirror, I swear I catch a glimpse of that shadowy figure standing silently in the corner, watching, whispering my name, and reminding me that room 6 never truly let me go. It was the middle of October when I found myself driving along a desolate highway in northern Nevada. I'd been on the road for hours, exhausted and eager to find a place to rest before the night grew too cold. Through the foggy darkness, a flickering neon sign appeared, "Redwood Inn, rooms available." The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a lone motorcycle parked haphazardly near the entrance. The building looked aged and neglected, with peeling paint and cracked windows. Despite its rundown appearance, I pulled in and entered the lobby. The air was stale and carried the faint scent of cigarette smoke and old wood. Behind the counter stood a man, perhaps in his 40s, with a weary expression and a slight twitch in his jaw. He didn't greet me immediately but watched me with an unsettling intensity. "I need a room for the night," I said, trying to mask my nervousness. He slid a key toward me, brass and heavy in my hand. "Room 9, he said in a low voice. "Second floor. If you hear laughter, don't look for its source." I forced a laugh, dismissing his cryptic warning. Sleep was more important than hotel superstitions. I took the narrow staircase to the second floor, the steps creaking under my weight. The hallway was long and dimly lit, the walls adorned with faded wallpaper and scuff marks. Room 9 was at the end, its door warped and slightly ajar as though inviting me inside. The room itself was small and plain, a bed, dresser, nightstand, and a small television. The air was cold, damp, and faintly metallic. I set my bag down and tried to relax, though the receptionist's words lingered ominously in my mind. Around midnight, I was woken by a faint sound, laughter. Soft, low, almost like it was coming from behind the walls themselves. I sat up, my heart racing, and listened. The laughter grew louder, echoing unnaturally in the room. I stood, gripping my phone for light, and looked around, but there was nothing. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It wasn't coming from under the bed or the closet. The sound seemed to exist in the room itself, bouncing off the walls in impossible ways. I told myself it was my imagination, but the laughter grew, twisting into something sinister, almost mocking. Then, the lights flickered and the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. Dark, amorphous forms stretched and twisted toward me, coalescing briefly into vague humanoid shapes. Each time the lights flickered, I could see faces, grinning, grotesque, faceless, leaning closer, laughing silently, their presence pressing in on me. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The key in my hand, once heavy and solid, now felt impossibly hot and slick, almost alive. I slammed the door and tried the window, but it was locked tight, frost forming along the edges as the cold seeped in. The laughter grew louder, now accompanied by whispers I couldn't understand, a chorus of voices layered over each other in mocking cadence. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. I crouched in the corner, trying to ignore the shifting shadows, the laughter, and the whispering. My eyes were drawn again and again to the dresser mirror, where I saw them, the shadowy forms, grinning, pressing closer. Their faces distorted into wide, unnatural smiles that seemed to stretch forever. I realized then that the laughter wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a living entity that fed on fear. Just before dawn, the room fell silent. The shadows receded, the air warmed, and the laughter stopped. The dresser mirror reflected only the empty room, no sign of the night's horrors. I bolted, descending the stairs and leaving the key on the counter without a word. The receptionist was gone. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering weakly in the morning light. Weeks later, I tried to find Redwood in online. Nothing. No records, no listings, no history. But late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint laughter echoing in my ears, and sometimes, in mirrors around my apartment, I catch shadowy forms with those grotesque, endless grins, reminding me that Room 9 never truly let me go. I was driving through rural Pennsylvania in early November, trying to escape the noise of the city for a few days. The sun had set hours ago, and a heavy fog rolled over the winding road, reducing visibility to just a few feet. My eyelids were heavy, and the thought of continuing on the empty highway was unbearable. That's when I saw it, a faint, flickering neon sign reading Willow Creek Motel, vacancies. The motel was small, wooden, and looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Its paint was peeling, windows fogged with age, and the parking lot was nearly empty, except for a single gray sedan parked near the entrance. I parked and entered the lobby, the door creaking ominously behind me. The air inside smelled of dust, mold, and faintly of old perfume. Behind the counter stood a woman, her hair pulled tightly back, her eyes sharp and unnervingly still. "Room?" I asked. "Room 11, she said softly, sliding a brass key across the counter. "Top floor. Don't look for room 12. I raised an eyebrow, trying to laugh off her warning, but I was too tired to care. I took the narrow staircase to the second floor, each step groaning under my weight. The hallway was lined with identical doors, faded numbers, and scuffed walls. Room 11 was at the end. I inserted the key, and it fit perfectly. The door opened smoothly. The room looked ordinary: bed, dresser, nightstand, small television. I set my bag down and tried to unwind. But something felt off. The air was heavier than normal, the shadows in the corners seemed darker, and the walls seemed subtly curved. I chalked it up to exhaustion and lay down, trying to sleep. Around midnight, I was awakened by a faint sound, footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Then I heard something else, the creak of a door opening, one that shouldn't exist. My curiosity outweighed my fear. I got out of bed and slowly approached the hallway. At the far end, past the familiar doors, was a door with no number. It wasn't on the map of the hallway, it wasn't listed on the wall, it had never been there before. A cold draft seeped through the crack at the bottom. Whispering, soft but insistent, drifted from the crack, "Come in." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe maintenance had forgotten a door. But something about it felt alive. I reached out and touched the doorknob. The metal was icy cold, almost burning, and my hand shook violently. The door swung open effortlessly, revealing a room that didn't belong in the motel. The walls were dark, stretching infinitely, the ceiling high and distant. Shadows pooled in the corners, forming humanoid shapes, faceless and still. The whispers grew louder, chanting my name. I stumbled backward in horror. When I turned, the hallway was gone. The room had swallowed the hallway entirely. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead. The shadows in the room began to move toward me, silent, liquid, stretching impossibly. I grabbed the doorknob again and pulled, desperate to escape. The door swung open, and I was back in room 11, the hallway normal again, the mysterious door gone. My hands were trembling uncontrollably, and my heart felt like it would burst. At dawn, I fled the motel, leaving the key on the counter. The receptionist was gone. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering weakly. Weeks later, I tried to find Willow Creek Motel online. Nothing. No listings, no history, no record of its existence. But I still see it in my dreams. The door that wasn't there, stretching infinitely, shadows pressing closer, whispering my name. And sometimes, in the corner of my room at home, I swear I catch a glimpse of it, the door, just slightly ajar, waiting for me to return. It was late October when I found myself driving through the winding roads of northern Michigan. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches scratching against the dark sky, and the wind howled through the empty streets like a living thing. I had been on the road for hours, exhausted, when a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance, Maplewood Motel, rooms available. The building looked aged, almost frozen in time. Its wooden siding was chipped and weathered, the windows dim, and the parking lot nearly empty except for a single rusted pickup truck. I parked and entered the lobby, greeted by a faint, musty smell mixed with the scent of old carpet. Behind the counter stood a man, perhaps in his 60s, with deep-set eyes that seemed to study me in a way that made my skin crawl. "Room?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Room 7, he said quietly, sliding a brass key across the counter. "Second floor. Don't make eye contact with the mirrors." I laughed nervously, dismissing his warning as an old motel superstition. Sleep was more important than cryptic advice. I took the narrow staircase to the second floor, the steps creaking under my weight. The hallway was lined with doors whose numbers were faded and chipped. Room 7 was at the end, its door slightly warped. I inserted the key and stepped inside. The room appeared ordinary, a bed, dresser, nightstand, and a large mirror leaning against the wall. I set my bag down and tried to relax. But there was a heaviness in the air, an almost oppressive presence that made me uneasy. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer than they should, bending toward me ever so subtly. Around midnight, I awoke to a faint tapping on the mirror. My heart raced as I sat up. The reflection showed me lying on the bed, but then, behind me, a shadowy figure appeared, faceless, tall, and still. I spun around, but the room was empty. The figure remained in the reflection, inching closer with every second, its presence oppressive and suffocating. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I grabbed a chair and smashed it against the mirror, but it didn't break, only rippling like water as if it were alive. The shadow in the reflection smiled, or at least, I imagined it did, pressing against the surface as if testing its limits. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. I tried to sleep, but the mirror never let me. Whispered voices emerged from it, soft and insistent, chanting my name, promising things I didn't want to hear. I realized that the room itself was alive, feeding on my fear, shaping reality around me. The shadows seemed to know every thought, every move, every heartbeat. Finally, as dawn approached, the shadow receded, the room fell silent, and the mirror returned to its normal reflective state. I bolted, racing down the stairs, leaving the key on the counter. The receptionist was gone, and the parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering in the morning light. Weeks later, I tried to find Maplewood Motel online. Nothing existed, no reviews, no history, no listings. But sometimes, when I pass a mirror in my apartment, I see a flicker of that shadow, standing silently, watching me, reminding me that room 7 never truly let me go. It was a frigid November evening when I was driving through the backroads of Vermont. The sky had long since turned a deep, oppressive gray, and the fog clung thickly to the winding road, making every turn uncertain. I had been driving for hours, exhausted, when a faint, flickering neon sign appeared, Pine Hollow Motel, vacancies. Its light wavered like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows across the empty parking lot. The motel itself looked old, worn, and slightly abandoned. Its paint was peeling, the roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were streaked with years of grime. I parked my car and stepped into the lobby. The air was cold and musty, carrying a faint scent of mildew and old wood. Behind the counter stood a woman, thin and pale, her eyes sharp and unreadable. "Room?" I asked, my voice tight from exhaustion. "Room 2, she said quietly, sliding a brass key toward me. "Second floor. Keep your voice down. The floor listens." I laughed nervously, brushing off her cryptic warning. Sleep was more important than ominous hints. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under my weight, and walked down the dim hallway lined with doors whose numbers were faded. Room 2 was at the far end. I inserted the key, turned the lock, and stepped inside. The room looked ordinary, a bed, dresser, nightstand, and a small television. But there was something subtly off about it. The walls seemed too close, the corners too dark. I set my bag down and tried to relax, but the unease in my chest refused to dissipate. Around midnight, I awoke to silence, too complete, too absolute. The only sound was my own breathing. Then I noticed it, faint creaking sounds coming from beneath the floor. At first, I assumed it was the building settling, but the sounds grew more deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth. I froze, listening. The creaking moved in patterns, almost like it was trying to communicate. I sat up, heart racing. The whisper of a voice brushed the edge of my hearing, "You're not alone." I jumped out of bed and tried the door, but it wouldn't open. Panic gripped me as the creaking grew louder, louder, faster. Shadows began to pull along the edges of the room, stretching unnaturally. I backed toward the bed, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The floor beneath me seemed to pulse and shift. I realized with growing horror that the floor itself was alive, listening, reacting to my fear. I spent hours, or maybe minutes, watching the floor, trapped in a silent, oppressive nightmare. Every movement I made seemed to echo, every step feeding something unseen. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the floor went silent. The shadows receded, the air warmed, and the door unlocked itself. I bolted downstairs, leaving the key on the counter. The receptionist was gone, and the parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering weakly in the morning light. Weeks later, I tried to find Pine Hollow Motel online. Nothing. No reviews, no records, no listing. But late at night, when I sit quietly in my apartment, I swear I can hear faint creaking beneath the floorboards, as if the motel still remembers me, still listens. I was traveling through rural Maine in late October, driving along a desolate highway shrouded in fog. The trees on either side of the road were bare, their skeletal branches scratching against the night sky. I had been driving for hours, exhausted and on the verge of falling asleep at the wheel, when I spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance, Fog Hollow Motel, vacancies. The building looked old, almost abandoned, with peeling paint, broken window panes, and a sagging roof. A single, rusted sedan sat in the empty parking lot. I parked and stepped inside, greeted by the musty scent of mildew mixed with faint traces of cigarette smoke. Behind the counter stood an older man with a weathered face, his eyes unnervingly still. "Room?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Room 12, he said quietly, sliding a brass key toward me. Top floor. Don't wander the hallway. I chuckled nervously, brushing off his warning. I was too tired to care. I climbed the narrow, creaking staircase and followed the dimly lit hallway lined with doors whose numbers were faded and chipped. Room 12 was at the end, its door slightly warped. I inserted the key and stepped inside. The room appeared ordinary, a bed, nightstand, dresser, and small television. But the air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift subtly when I wasn't looking directly at them. I set my bag down and tried to sleep, but exhaustion didn't banish the creeping sense of unease. Around midnight, I awoke to a strange feeling that the room had changed. The hallway outside my door seemed longer, darker, impossibly stretched. Curious, despite my fear, I opened the door and stepped out. The hallway extended endlessly, doors repeating their numbers over and over. Room 12 was behind me, then ahead, then behind again. Panic gripped me. I tried to run, but the hallway seemed alive, bending and twisting, always bringing me back to the same point. Whispers echoed faintly from the walls, overlapping and unintelligible. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, never fully visible, yet undeniably present. I realized with growing horror that the motel itself was shifting, feeding off my fear, reshaping reality around me. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. My legs ached, my breath came in ragged gasps, and every door I tried led me back to the same infinite corridor. The whispers grew louder, chanting my name, urging me to stay. I backed against the wall, staring at a door ahead, and noticed something horrifying. In the peephole, I could see myself, standing outside, staring back at me. I stumbled backward and tripped into room 12. The room appeared normal again, the shadows gone, the air still. I bolted downstairs, leaving the key on the counter. The receptionist was gone. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering weakly in the morning light. Weeks later, I tried to find Fog Hollow Motel online. Nothing. No records, no reviews, no history. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can see the endless hallway stretching infinitely, doors repeating endlessly, whispers calling my name, and I know that the motel never truly let me leave. It was early November when I found myself driving along a lonely stretch of highway in rural Kentucky. The night was bitterly cold, and the wind whistled through the bare trees like a chorus of whispers. I had been on the road for hours, and exhaustion was making my eyelids heavy. Just when I thought I might have to pull over on the side of the road, I saw a flickering neon sign, Cedar Grove Motel, vacancies. The motel was small and aged, its wood siding warped, paint peeling, and windows clouded with grime. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a single black SUV parked near the entrance. I parked and stepped into the lobby, greeted by a musty smell mixed with faint traces of burnt coffee. Behind the counter stood a man with deep lines etched into his face, his eyes piercing and unsettlingly calm. "Room?" I asked, my voice tight from fatigue. "Room 3, he said softly, sliding a brass key toward me. "Upstairs. Don't make noise. It doesn't like it." I chuckled nervously, brushing off the warning as superstition, and took the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hallway was long, dimly lit, lined with doors whose numbers were faded and chipped. Room 3 was at the far end, its door slightly warped, keyhole dark and ominous. I inserted the key and stepped inside. The room looked ordinary at first, a bed, dresser, nightstand, and a small television. But the air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than natural. I set my bag down and tried to unwind, but unease crept steadily up my spine. Around midnight, I was awakened by a low, distant scream. At first, I thought it was outside the motel, maybe a drunk or someone lost in the woods. But the scream came again, this time, clearly from inside the room. My heart raced, and I froze, listening. The scream repeated, rising in intensity, then cutting off abruptly. I jumped out of bed, my hands shaking, and scanned the room. Everything seemed normal, yet the oppressive feeling in the air grew stronger. The dresser drawers began to open slowly, inch by inch, and then slam shut. I realized with dawning horror that the room itself was alive, reacting to my presence, feeding off my fear. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The key in my hand felt impossibly hot, burning my palm. Shadows gathered in the corners, stretching unnaturally toward me. The screaming began again, louder, closer, but it wasn't outside, it came from within the walls, within the room itself. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. I crouched on the bed, trying to hide, listening to the room breathe and scream. Then the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw the source, dozens of shadowy figures pressed against the walls, faceless, mouths open in silent screams that echoed in my mind. Finally, as dawn approached, the room fell silent. The shadows dissolved, the air lightened, and the door unlocked itself. I bolted downstairs, leaving the key on the counter. The receptionist was gone. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering weakly in the morning light. Weeks later, I tried to find Cedar Grove Motel online. Nothing. No reviews, no listings, no history. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear the faint echoes of screaming from the corners of my apartment, and mirrors reflect shadowy figures pressing against the walls, reminding me that room 3 never truly let me go. It was late October when I was driving through the remote backroads of West Virginia. The night was thick with fog, and the trees on either side of the road were skeletal, their branches scratching against the sky. Exhausted and nearly out of options, I saw a flickering neon sign in the distance, Elmwood Motel, vacancies. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a single, battered van parked at the edge. The motel looked as though it had been frozen in time, aged wood, peeling paint, and cracked windows. I parked and stepped into the lobby. The air was musty, a mix of old carpet, mildew, and faint traces of burnt coffee. Behind the counter stood a woman with an unsettlingly calm expression, her eyes sharp and unreadable. "Room?" I asked. "Room 8, she said softly, sliding a brass key across the counter. "Second floor. Don't let the guests see you." I forced a laugh, brushing off the cryptic warning. I was too tired to care. I took the narrow staircase, each step creaking ominously, and followed the dim hallway lined with doors whose numbers were faded. Room 8 was at the end, its door slightly warped. I inserted the key and stepped inside. The room appeared normal, bed, dresser, nightstand, and a small television. But the air felt heavy, oppressive. Shadows in the corners seemed darker, stretching unnaturally. I set my bag down and tried to relax, but an unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was from outside the room, but the voice was close, too close. I scanned the room, my heart pounding. Nothing. Yet the whispering continued, faint but insistent. Then I felt it, a presence beside me on the bed. I jumped up, but the space was empty. My mind raced. I realized with growing horror that someone, or something, was in the room with me, invisible, watching, breathing. Every time I moved, I could feel it shift, staying just beyond the edge of perception. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. Every sound I made, every shuffle, every whispered word, was echoed by the invisible guest, as if mocking me. The shadows in the room began to stretch toward me, subtly at first, then more aggressively, pressing close, cold and suffocating. Finally, in a desperate bid, I smashed the small television against the wall. The screen shattered, sparks flying, and for a moment, everything went silent. The oppressive weight lifted. I bolted for the door, and it opened this time. I ran down the stairs, leaving the key on the counter. The receptionist was gone. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering weakly in the morning light. Weeks later, I tried to find Elmwood Motel online. Nothing. No reviews, no listings, no history. But sometimes, when I sit quietly in my apartment, I feel a presence near me, shifting just beyond sight, and I swear I hear faint whispers, reminding me that the invisible guest never truly left room 8. It was a bitter December night when I found myself driving through the snowy backroads of northern Minnesota. The wind howled, rattling the car, and the headlights barely pierced the thick fog settling over the forested road. I had been driving for hours, my eyelids heavy, when I spotted a faint neon sign in the distance, Evernight Motel, vacancies. The building looked ancient, wooden siding warped and peeling, windows fogged over, and a sagging roof that groaned under the weight of snow. The parking lot was empty except for a single, rusted minivan parked askew. I parked and stepped inside the lobby. The air was musty, tinged with the faint scent of smoke and something else I couldn't identify, something metallic and old. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s, tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "Room?" I asked, my voice tight with exhaustion. "Room 1, he said quietly, sliding a brass key toward me. "Top floor. It's the last key. Don't lose it. And whatever you do, don't use it twice." I laughed nervously, dismissing the warning, and took the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hallway was long and dim, lined with doors whose numbers were faded and cracked. Room 1 was at the far end. I inserted the key and stepped inside. The room looked normal at first, a bed, nightstand, dresser, and a small television. But the air was heavy, dense, almost suffocating. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching unnaturally, moving subtly when I wasn't looking directly at them. I set my bag down and tried to relax, though unease gnawed at my chest. Around midnight, I awoke to a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. It grew louder, sharper, almost like nails raking across wood. Then came the whispers, faint and overlapping, repeating the same words in a dozen voices, "The key, the key, the key." My heart raced, and I realized that the room itself seemed alive, aware of me, feeding on my fear. Suddenly, the key in my pocket grew impossibly hot. I dropped it, and it rolled under the bed. The shadows shifted, coalescing into figures, dozens of faceless forms pressing closer, whispering in tones I couldn't comprehend. The room seemed to expand impossibly, walls stretching, the ceiling rising higher, the floor rippling. I scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't open. Panic surged through me as the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening chorus. Then I noticed something horrifying. The key had disappeared, only to appear in the hand of one of the shadowy figures, extended toward me, its faceless gaze fixed, silent yet commanding. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed the key. The shadows recoiled, the room contracted, and everything went silent. I bolted down the stairs, key clutched tightly, leaving the receptionist nowhere to be found. The parking lot was empty, the neon sign flickering weakly in the early morning light. Weeks later, I tried to find Evernight Motel online. Nothing. No history, no records, no reviews. But the key remained in my pocket, cold and heavy. At night, I sometimes hear whispers, faint and insistent, "Use it again, come back, it's waiting." And the worst part? Last week, I looked in the mirror and saw a shadowy figure behind me, holding a key. A key that looked exactly like mine. And I realized, with a chill that froze my blood, that the Evernight Motel might already be here, with me.